Applications for unemployment benefits slightly rising from the previous week's revised level. Jobless claims hovering around pre-COVID levels, indicating solid demand for workers. However, we need to look underneath the surface. For a closer look at the layers of the labor market, we've got ADP Chief Economist Neela Richardson. Neela, it's always fantastic to see you and to get your perspective on these matters because you do have that deep understanding of what's happening under the surface of the labor market. So I'm curious what you're seeing. I know you guys have been doing a lot of survey work. What have you been turning up?
Hi, good to see you, Julie. Well, overall, if you look at ADP payroll data, we're still seeing a very solid market. And even though initial jobless claims can move quickly back and forth from week to week, they're still at 2-year lows. So there's strength there. But underneath the hood, as you mentioned, there is pockets of weakness, manufacturing being one. But what's really interesting is when we turn to our worker sentiment survey, which shows that in the U.S., around 2/3 of U.S. workers feel like they're living paycheck to paycheck. So even though we've seen enormous pay growth over the last 4 years coming out of the pandemic, people are still feeling the pinch of inflation. And that is leading to different ways of providing labor, like getting a second job, for example.
Neela, there's a lot we look at when it comes to labor market, whether we think about the unemployment rate, jobless claims, wage growth. Is there a particular metric that you're focused on when we think about some of these cracks?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think my center of gravity is pay. It's payroll, because that is really where the labor market finds its equilibrium. That is the balance between employers' demand for workers and workers' supply of labor. And you can see how that varies across industries, how it varies across demographics, but importantly, how it connects to inflation. What economists are always the most worried about when it comes to the labor market and inflation is that wages would spiral out of control and trigger inflation. We're not seeing that yet. We haven't seen it, actually. Wages have fallen a lot in terms of growth from the peak pandemic growth rates that they had coming out of it, but they're still elevated. And so in my view, it's why inflation hasn't gone back to more comfortable levels quite yet.
Neela, while we have you, I have to get your take on DOGE and what's happening with government employment, but not even just direct government employment, government contractors as well, right? And, this sort of ripple effect, what's happening in D.C. What should we be looking for in terms of the labor market indicators to see where that's being felt?
I think, Julie, the first place to look would be those initial jobless claims that won't get all the difference in workers who are applying to claims, which is a proxy for layoffs that many economists use in the area, and not just the DC metro area. You know that federal workers and federal contractors are nationwide. So looking at those claims data is important, as we did today. Also looking in the private sector, seeing if maybe workers are staying put, they're seeing more competition in the labor market, how the private sector responds to what's going on the federal side will be interesting to watch over time. Too early to see that yet, but something I'll be paying attention to.
What about immigration? That's something that I feel like has been maybe a little underreported as tariffs have dominated the conversation. What impact do you think immigration policies could have on the labor side? Is that a concern to you at this point?
Well, if you look at government statistics, the U.S. labor force employment is supposed to increase at a fraction over the next decade that it did over the previous decade. So like 0.4% annually compared to an annual rate of 1.3% in the previous decade. So employment growth is slowing because a lot of workers are retiring. And so the question is, how do you keep up with consumption and growth? One of those ways is through immigration. Now, it's interesting to me also in this time of hybrid, despite some of the CEO sentiments on hybrid versus remote versus in-office work, one thing that remote and flexible work options do is widen the pool of workers that an industry and a company has access to. And that can be borderless depending on the company. So I think all of this is still in flux. Immigration historically has been really important to sectors like construction, for example. So how the labor market evolves from here will have to take into account the fact that the working age population is aging and we'll need some workers in key industries.
Well, and not only will it affect sort of supply and demand, but it'll, going back to the idea of wages also, couldn't we see some sort of knock-on effects from the immigration picture on wages as well?
Whenever there are shortages, especially like in high demand sectors like construction, like agriculture, you'll see wages adjust. And that's why it is my primary indicator of the labor market, because it reflects this worker supply issue that will be vital to us as the demographics of the country change.
And when you think about the Federal Reserve, we've been talking a lot about inflation and inflation likely to remain elevated over the long term. How much more pressure does that put on the employment picture for the Fed?
Well, right now, the labor market is playing along. It's allowing the Fed to be cautious, to be patient. You saw that the unemployment rate went down to 4%. And so, yes, particular people are always part of the rule outside of what that unemployment rate shows. And there are people who are taking longer to find jobs in this economy. However, the unemployment rate at 4% means that the Fed doesn't have to move quickly, that it can incorporate policy change into its decisions. And I think that's what we're seeing right now.
Neela, good to see you. Thank you so much. Looking forward to more jobs data and more analysis from you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.